I don't intend to make this one too long, but just a quick word on the Afghanistan presidential elections which are ongoing. I don't know a great deal about the individual candidates. I believe Abdullah may be in the lead. He looks to be the front runner right now. Hamid Karzai has certainly been a controversial figure, as most world leaders who serve more than 10 years usually are. His administration has been, I believe, pretty corrupt, and some of the human rights violations that have gone on within his administration are really not much better than Taliban, but still better, or at least not quite as bad. He certainly had a tough job on his hands, and the next president of Afghanistan will have a pretty tough job as well. Running a country like Afghanistan sounds exceedingly obvious, but it's no easy task. I think, though there's several important things about this election, it is technically the first democratic transition in Afghan history. That's surely something that should be significant and progressive. The election was, of course, not without flaws. People were intimidated, there was acts of violence, and there was corruption. But I would argue that in a country like Afghanistan, the very fact that the election has taken place is progress in itself. You can't expect an election that's squeaky clean in a country that's had nothing but theocratic dictatorship and civil war for 30 years. Of course it's not going to be a perfect election. So you can't hold it to Western standards and sort of say that it's totally free and fair. Of course it's not going to be. But like I say, a country like Afghanistan, that's just wishful thinking. I have enormous respect for the courage of the Afghan people, especially Afghan women. The sort of threats that they have defied to go to the polls shows just how much they hold it into regard. And for me, that also sheds a light on how people in countries that do have freedom of choice, freedom of expression, really do take it for granted. So when people hear whinge about politicians, and it's the right to do so, but I think they take it for granted that we have had political stability for over a very long time, over 180 years, really. People do take it for granted. We have never really had the situation of Afghanistan where people are intimidated at the polls. There's been some cases of corruption at council level, but really there hasn't been the same thing. People do take that for granted in this country, our political stability. Yes, there's tempers rise, and yes, there's genuine animosity sometimes. I mean, I've certainly felt animosity towards, for example, particular Tory policies and some Labour policies, but we are lucky in this country. We do have political stability, and we can't take that for granted. But for me, this raises another question, which is about Western intervention in Afghanistan. My question would be, would this have been possible without Western intervention? Now, a lot of people turn around and say, oh, well, look at Arab Spring. Those countries, people rose up against the dictatorships eventually without Western intervention. But the demographics of Afghanistan are different. Generally, it's a lot poorer than most of the Arab Spring countries. And there's a much lower level of education than the Arab Spring countries. For example, lower level than, say, Egypt. The rate of illiteracy in Afghanistan is very high. When you consider these demographics, I think outside intervention was almost certainly needed. The Taliban provided a safe haven for those who attacked the Twin Towers on 9/11. Now, I'm not just reading off Dick Cheney's script. That's just a fact. Yes, there is a lot of questions to be asked about Bush's links with the House of Saud. Definitely there's questions to be asked about that. But whatever way you look at it, the Taliban was a pretty vile regime that really needed to be removed. It was an extreme fascist regime that treated women as worth less than dogs. Men weren't treated much better. If a man had we often hear about the way the Taliban mistreated women. They didn't treat men much better either. They treated women as worth less than dogs, but they treated men pretty appallingly as well if they didn't, for example, have the correct length of beard. This was a fascist, evil regime as far as I'm concerned, and being removed in itself was a good thing. It's not that Karzai was a huge amount better. He presided over a corrupt administration, and he was often accused of playing double games. Now the key is that when withdrawal happens, whether it be the end of this year or the beginning of next year, whenever it is, whenever there's that power transfer to the Afghan army from Western coalition forces, the future of Afghanistan, what it will be. These elections, whilst not perfect, surely are a progressive sign. The very fact that women are going to the polls, that's something that would have been unthinkable under the Taliban. Surely that has to be welcomed. Is it ideal? No, it's not. The fact that the threats exist shows that it's dangerous. But what I would argue is the very fact they're going to the polls and defying the Taliban must be something that's welcomed. Their courage should be welcomed and praised. But also, I think it demonstrates that Western intervention maybe was justified, because without Western intervention I very much doubt this situation would be possible. I believe it is time to pull out. I think a lot of young coalition troops have been killed, but I don't think their deaths have been in vain. Their deaths have been for this day, for a democratic transition of power in Afghanistan, which may pave the way for a better future, ultimately nation building. I think, we're at a phase of history where intervention is controversial because of Iraq, but I believe history will judge intervention in a better way than current opinion polls. That's my gut feeling. I could be completely wrong, and there may be one day I make a video and say I was misled, I was misinformed, etc., etc. But my gut instinct at the moment, even if it is for resources, right? Let's say Western policy is all about resources. Does that really change the fact that an evil regime has been removed? Yes, they're trying to get back into power, but a lot of the Taliban nowadays, I suspect, are young men who are joining as a form of opportunity, because the Taliban offers them pay incentives that are higher than the Afghan National Army. So they're not actually religious fundamentalists. The original Taliban were. I believe the moderate Taliban in a country like Afghanistan, moderate obviously takes different meaning, but I believe the opportunists need to be spoken to. Those who joined the Taliban because they were unemployed, because they, of one reason or another, they're not necessarily religious fundamentalists compared to what the original Taliban were. I believe those people need to be reached out to, and the new Afghan government does need to reach out to those people, otherwise you're going to have a disenfranchised proportion of the population, which will be sympathetic to the Taliban, and then the insurgency will just continue like it did in Iraq. So if Afghanistan's to have a better future, the new president needs to be very objective. He needs to put women's rights and human rights very high on his agenda, and it will be a he. And also investment in the country. What that means is security. It also means, unfortunately, it will mean some sort of reconciliation with the Taliban. Unfortunately, that's unavoidable. Otherwise, you're going to have the Taliban as a marginalised group, and they'll be hell-bent on getting back to power. So you need to have some compromise with the Taliban. I can understand why women's groups and so on are cautious about that, but without it, I think this war is going to go on and on. So, but you do need a progressive government that does take women's rights seriously, that takes human rights seriously. I'm not saying it will be like a Western country, but at least provide the basic groundwork. At least that. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. You're not going to nation build overnight, but at least lay the foundation for that, for a civic society. I'd like to say I hope it's not based on theocracy, but Afghanistan's a very conservative country, so religion unfortunately is going to play a part in the politics of the new system. But whatever happens, I believe that this event in itself is something to be encouraged. It is, whatever way you look at it, is the first democratic transition of power from Hamid Karzai to the new president. Flawless? Of course not. There's problems in this election, but the very fact it's happening in itself is something that needs to be praised. Let me know your thoughts.